There is a frequency on the park radio that no one talks about. It is not listed in any manual. It is not assigned to any ranger station, any fire crew, any search and rescue team. But if you sit alone in the communications room at the Toklot River outpost on a winter night, and you let the dial drift past the standard channels, you will find it. A low hum. A breath that is not quite a breath. And sometimes, if the tundra wind dies down to nothing, a sound that sits somewhere between a moan and a word in a language that predates every tongue spoken in this valley. I found that frequency 11 years ago. I have never told anyone what I heard that night, because what followed in the weeks after made the sound on the radio the least terrifying thing I would encounter in Denali National Park and Preserve. The autumn of that year arrived like a door closing. The last tour buses had rolled south through the single gravel road that cuts through the park, carrying the final wave of summer visitors back to Anchorage and Fairbanks and the lower 48. The seasonal staff packed their duffels and disappeared with them. By the second week of September, the population of the park shrank to a handful of overwintering personnel, a few researchers finishing late-season fieldwork, and the animals. The grizzlies were gorging on the last of the blueberries along the ridges. The caribou herds were beginning their drift toward lower ground. The wolves sang at dusk from the Teklenica drainage, and somewhere in the 6 million acres of wilderness that surrounded me, something else was moving. Something that left tracks too large and too deliberate to belong to any animal cataloged in the records I maintained as a backcountry patrol ranger. I had been stationed at Denali for 7 years by then. 7 years of 12-hour days in the field. 7 years of monitoring bear activity and maintaining trails and responding to the occasional lost hiker or altitude sickness case along the higher ridges. I had walked more miles across that landscape than most people drive in a decade. I knew the smell of the glacier silt in the braided rivers, the way the light flattened against Denali's south face at midday, the particular crunch of tundra moss under a boot in late August when the moisture begins to crystallize. I thought I knew this park. I was wrong. The first report came from Daniel Taylor on September 14th. Daniel was 50 years old, a wildlife population analyst who had been conducting annual surveys in the park for over a decade. He was not the kind of man who startled easily. He had tracked collared wolves through whiteout blizzards. He had stood 40 yards from a charging sow grizzly and calmly deployed bear spray without flinching. His field notes were meticulous, his observations precise, and his tolerance for speculation non-existent. So when Daniel radioed in from his survey camp near the Sanctuary River and asked me to come out and look at something, his voice carrying a quality I had never heard in it before, I did not hesitate. I reached his camp by late afternoon. The September light was already thinning, the sun carving a low arc across the southern sky that promised no more than 8 hours of useful daylight. Daniel was standing at the edge of his campsite, his arms folded across his chest, staring at the ground. He did not greet me. He simply pointed. The tracks began at the gravel bar along the river's edge and continued in a straight line toward the northwest, disappearing into a thicket of alder and dwarf birch. They were bipedal. Each impression was roughly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. The stride length was enormous, easily 4.5 feet between prints. The depth of the impressions in the river silt suggested a weight of at least 500 pounds, possibly more. Each print showed 5 distinct toes, the largest positioned medially, like a human foot scaled to proportions that defied reason. I crouched beside the nearest track and placed my own boot next to it for reference. My size 11 looked like a child's shoe beside it. Daniel spoke without looking at me. He said he had found them that morning when he walked down to the river to filter water. He said they were fresh, probably no more than 6 hours old based on the moisture seepage pattern in the silt. He said he had followed them for approximately 200 yards before the ground transitioned to rocky tundra and the prints became intermittent, then vanished. I asked him what he thought had made them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he did not want to say what he thought, because saying it out loud would mean he believed it, and believing it would change everything he understood about this landscape. I did not press him. I photographed the tracks, measured them, recorded the GPS coordinates, and noted the heading of the trail. Then I helped Daniel break down his camp and relocate to a position closer to the road. Neither of us spoke much during the hike out. The wind picked up from the north, carrying the sharp mineral scent of the Alaska Range, and somewhere far off in the valley, a sound rolled across the tundra. It was not a wolf. It was not a bear. It was low and resonant and sustained, like someone dragging a cello bow across the lowest string of an instrument the size of a building. Daniel stopped walking. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen there before. Fear. The woman who came with questions. Rachel Moore arrived at the Toklat station on September 18th, 4 days after I had documented the tracks at the Sanctuary River. She was 35, compact and athletic, with close-cropped auburn hair and the kind of focused intensity that made you feel like she was studying you the way she studied everything else. She carried a weatherproof case that held recording equipment, a directional microphone array, and a laptop loaded with acoustic analysis software. Her credentials listed her as an independent field researcher specializing in primate vocalizations. But I learned quickly that her actual area of interest was far more specific than that. Rachel had been tracking reports of anomalous bipedal activity across Alaska for 4 years. She had compiled a database of over 300 incidents spanning the Alaska Range, the Brooks Range, the Wrangell Mountains, and the coastal forests of the Tongass. Footprint casts, audio recordings, witness interviews, thermal camera footage. She had none of the breathless enthusiasm of the amateur enthusiasts who occasionally showed up at ranger stations with blurry photographs and wild theories. Her approach was methodical, clinical, almost cold. She treated each data point as exactly that, a point. No narrative attached, no conclusion assumed. She had heard about the Sanctuary River tracks through a contact at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I never learned who. She had driven up from Anchorage within 48 hours and presented herself at my station with a request to access the backcountry for acoustic monitoring. Her permits were in order. Her equipment list was thorough. There was no legitimate reason to deny her request. But Peterson did not want her there. Harold Peterson was 64 and had served as the district supervisor for the northern section of Denali for over 20 years. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same granite that formed the base of the mountain. He had a quiet authority that came not from raising his voice, but from the sheer weight of his experience. When Peterson told you something, you listened, because the man had seen more of this park than anyone alive. He called me into his office the evening Rachel arrived. He closed the door, which he almost never did, and sat down behind his desk with his fingers steepled under his chin. He told me that he had seen tracks like those before, twice. Once in 1991 near the Eelson Visitor Center, once in 2003 along the upper Toklat drainage. Both times, the tracks appeared during the shoulder season, after the summer crowds had gone and before the full winter lockdown. Both times, other things happened in the weeks that followed. Equipment malfunctions, GPS units giving impossible readings, radio interference on frequencies that should have been clear. And both times, animals began behaving in ways that did not fit any known pattern. He told me that in 1991, a herd of caribou was found dead in a draw near Polychrome Pass. 37 animals. No predator marks, no disease indicators. The necropsy reports listed cause of death as cardiac arrest. All 37, simultaneously, based on the positioning of the bodies. I asked him what he thought had killed them. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said that whatever it was still out there, and it had been out there for as long as the mountain itself. And there were some things that the Park Service did not put in its reports because putting them in reports would require explanations that no one was prepared to give. He told me to keep Rachel Moore close to the road corridor and away from the upper valleys. He told me to document nothing beyond standard wildlife observations, and then he told me to be careful. I nodded, but even as I left his office, I knew I was not going to follow those instructions, because the coordinates of those tracks pointed toward a drainage I knew well, a place called the East Fork of the Toklat River, and I had been hearing things from that direction for weeks. Not the radio frequency, something else. Something that carried across the tundra in the hours after midnight, when the sky was a deep indigo bruise and the stars were close enough to touch. I knew Rachel had the equipment to capture it, and I knew that whatever was making that sound, it was getting closer. Rachel and I set out on September 20th. I told Peterson we were conducting a routine acoustic survey for wolf activity along the East Fork. It was not entirely a lie. There were wolves in that drainage, a pack of 9 that I had been monitoring since spring. But the wolves were not what drew us into those hills. We established a base camp at a gravel bench overlooking the East Fork, approximately 12 miles from the road. The terrain was classic Denali backcountry, open tundra rolling in waves of rust and gold, the dwarf vegetation already turning with the season. Gravel bars along the river, pale and wide, and beyond them, the foothills rising in shoulders of scree and exposed rock toward the high peaks that formed the spine of the range, their summits wrapped in cloud. Rachel set up her microphone array in a half-circle facing the valley. 5 directional microphones mounted on adjustable poles, each connected to a central recording unit that could isolate and triangulate sound sources within a 2-mile radius. The system was remarkably sensitive. She demonstrated by clapping her hands once, and the software immediately plotted the sound source with a margin of error less than 10 feet. That first night, we heard the wolves. They called from a ridge to the north, their voices threading through the valley in the familiar rise and fall that I had heard 1,000 times. Rachel recorded everything, her eyes fixed on the waveform display, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. And then, at approximately 2:37 in the morning, the wolves stopped. Not gradually. Not the way a pack typically winds down after a chorus. They stopped all at once, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire valley. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no water, no insect hum, nothing. Rachel looked at me. Her face was lit by the pale glow of her laptop screen, and I could see that her expression had changed. The clinical detachment was still there, but beneath it, something else had surfaced. Recognition. She whispered that this was exactly what happened in every other location she had investigated. The silence came first. Always. We waited. At 2:51, the sound began. It started low, almost subsonic, a vibration I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. It rose slowly, gaining texture and depth, until it became a vocalization unlike anything in my experience. It was not a howl. It was not a roar. It occupied a register that seemed to exist between those categories, a sustained, modulated tone that shifted in pitch and cadence as if communicating something deliberate. It echoed off the rock faces of the valley walls and folded back on itself, creating harmonics that made it impossible to determine direction. Rachel was frozen at her station. The waveform on her screen was massive, dwarfing the wolf recordings that preceded it. She pointed at a data readout and said the frequency range extended below 20 Hz, infrasound, the kind of sound pressure that could induce anxiety, nausea, and visual disturbances in humans at sufficient intensity. The call lasted 19 seconds, then it stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. We did not sleep. The man who had been here before, Matthew Jackson, arrived at our base camp on September 22nd, and he arrived uninvited. I heard him before I saw him. The crunch of boots on gravel, steady and unhurried, coming from the south along the riverbank. I reached for the bear spray on my belt and positioned myself between the sound and Rachel, who was reviewing the previous night's recordings inside the tent. He emerged from behind a cut bank in the river channel, a tall man with a lean frame and a beard that had gone gray at the edges. He was 42, though the lines in his face and the deliberate economy of his movements suggested someone who had lived harder than his years would indicate. He carried a heavy pack, a bolt-action rifle in a scabbard on his left side, and a pair of binoculars around his neck that looked like they cost more than my truck. He stopped about 30 yards out and raised both hands, palms forward. Standard backcountry etiquette, no surprise approach. He introduced himself as a wilderness guide out of Talkeetna. He said he had been running trips into the Denali backcountry for 15 years. He said he had a permit for the East Fork drainage. And then he said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He said he had heard the call last night, He said he had been hearing it for 3 nights, moving north along the valley, each night closer than the last. And he said this was not the first time. Matthew Jackson had encountered whatever was making that sound 7 years earlier, in a drainage on the north side of the Alaska Range, near the Kantishna Hills. He had been guiding a party of 4 hunters, legally pursuing Dall sheep in a permitted area. On the 3rd night of their trip, one of the hunters disappeared from camp. No struggle, no tracks leading away from his tent, no blood, no torn fabric. The man was simply gone. They found his boots placed neatly outside the tent flap, toes pointed toward the mountain, as if he had taken them off carefully before stepping out into the night barefoot. They never found him. The search lasted 11 days and covered every drainage within a 15-mile radius. Helicopters, tracking teams with dogs, thermal imaging flights, nothing. But during the search, Matthew found tracks, the same kind of tracks I had documented at the Sanctuary River. 18 inches long, bipedal, impossibly deep. They led from the missing hunter's tent directly up a scree slope at an angle that no human could have climbed, not even with mountaineering equipment. The tracks ended at a rock face, not at a ledge, not at a cave entrance, at a vertical wall of solid granite. Matthew had not reported the tracks to the search coordinators. He said he knew what would happen if he did. They would dismiss him. They would question his reliability. They would bury it under the same silence that buried everything else that did not fit the narrative. If you are still with me, listening to these words in whatever room or car or trail you find yourself right now, I want you to know that what I am telling you is exactly what happened. No exaggeration, no embellishment. And if this story has found its way to you, then maybe it was supposed to. If you feel something from these words, I would be grateful if you took a moment to leave a comment, share your own experience, and hit the like and subscribe buttons so these accounts continue reaching the people who need to hear them. Rachel was skeptical of Matthew at first. She questioned his timeline, his coordinates, his motivations. She asked him why he had come to the East Fork specifically and how he had known we were there. He said he had not known we were there. He said he had come because the sound was coming from this valley, and he had spent 7 years trying to understand what had taken his client from that tent, and every lead he had followed eventually pointed back to Denali. I watched the two of them debate across the campfire that evening, the flames throwing shifting light across their faces. Rachel insisted on empirical evidence, recordings, measurements, falsifiable hypotheses. Matthew insisted that empirical evidence was precisely what kept getting lost, suppressed, or explained away, and that the thing in this valley operated according to rules that did not care about human methods of classification. I sat between them and said nothing, because I was thinking about Peterson, about the caribou in 1991, about the radio frequency, and about the fact that in the 7 years I had worked in Denali, I had filed 6 reports of anomalous track findings, and every single one of them had been returned to me with the same notation in red ink. Inconclusive, do not distribute. That night, the sound came again. Closer. Rachel's triangulation software placed the source approximately 1.3 miles to the northwest, in a narrow side valley that I knew from the topographic maps but had never entered. The valley had no official name. On the older maps, the ones predating the park's redesignation in 1980, it was marked with a small symbol that I had always assumed was a surveyor's notation. But when I looked at it more carefully that night, under the beam of my headlamp, I realized it was not a surveyor's mark. It was a warning symbol, a small triangle with an X through it, the same symbol used on military ordnance maps to indicate an area of unknown hazard. I asked Matthew if he had ever been into that valley. He shook his head, but he said he had spoken to someone who had. What Nicole knew. Nicole Martin was 58 and had lived within sight of the Alaska Range for her entire life. She was born in a small community near Cantwell, the town that sits at the junction of the park's highway and the Denali Highway, where the road bends north toward the park entrance. Her family had been in the region for 4 generations, predating the establishment of Mount McKinley National Park in 1917. Her grandfather had been one of the local hunters and trappers who had worked the drainages of the Nenana and Teklanika rivers long before any government agency drew lines on a map and called it protected land. I knew Nicole because she supplied firewood to the Park Service housing complex during the winter months. She drove an ancient flatbed truck with a homemade wooden rack on the back, and she delivered split spruce and birch with a quiet efficiency that never included small talk. She was a private woman, reserved, not unfriendly, but not inviting either. She carried herself with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that listening was more valuable than speaking. I drove down to Cantwell on September 24th, leaving Rachel and Matthew at the East Fork camp with instructions to continue recording but to stay within 1 mile of the base. The drive took 2 hours along the park road, then south on the highway. I found Nicole at her property, a modest cabin set back from the road behind a stand of white spruce. Smoke was rising from the chimney. A dog, an old husky mix with clouded eyes, lay on the porch and did not lift its head when I pulled in. Nicole met me at the door and invited me inside without asking why I had come. She poured coffee from a percolator on the wood stove and sat across from me at a kitchen table that was covered in topographic maps, their edges curled and stained with years of use. I told her about the tracks. I told her about the sound. I told her about the unmarked valley. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for nearly a full minute. Then she stood, went to a shelf near the back wall, and returned with a leather-bound journal that was old enough that the cover had cracked along the spine. She opened it to a page near the middle and turned it toward me. The handwriting was faded but legible. The entry was dated March 1947 and was written by her grandfather, a man named Thomas Martin. The passage described a winter hunting trip into the high country above the Toklat River. Thomas and 2 companions had been following a moose track when they encountered a set of prints in the snow that Thomas described as resembling those of a barefoot man of impossible stature. The prints led uphill into a narrow valley that the local Athabascan people called by a name that Nicole pronounced slowly for me, though she said there was no precise English translation. The closest approximation was the place where the tall ones watch. Thomas had followed the tracks into the valley. His companions refused to go further and waited at the entrance. Thomas went in alone and was gone for 6 hours. When he returned, he would not speak about what he had seen, but his journal entry, written that night by lamplight, described a sensation of being observed from multiple directions simultaneously, of hearing a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, and of finding, at the far end of the valley, a series of rock formations arranged in a pattern that was too regular, too deliberate, to be natural. He described the formations as standing stones, 7 of them, roughly 8 feet tall, arranged in a semicircle facing the mountain. The snow around them was completely undisturbed, as if the stones had been placed there before the last snowfall and nothing had approached them since. But at the base of the central stone, pressed into a shallow depression, was a single footprint, the same kind of print he had been following. It was pressed into frozen ground so hard that the force required to create it would have been extraordinary. And inside the print, Thomas found something that made him leave the valley at a run and never return. Hair. A tuft of coarse, reddish-brown hair, approximately 4 inches long, caught in the ice at the edge of the impression. Nicole closed the journal and looked at me. She said her grandfather never went back into the high country after that trip. He trapped the lower valleys for the rest of his life and refused to discuss the incident with anyone except his wife, who recorded parts of the story in a separate journal that Nicole said had been lost in a cabin fire in 1973. She said other families in the area had similar stories, passed down through generations. The tall ones were not a myth. They were not a legend told to entertain children. They were a fact of life in the shadow of Denali, as real as the bears and the wolves and the winter storms that could kill you in an hour. She told me that the creatures were not aggressive by nature. They were territorial, they observed, they tracked, they made themselves known only when they chose to. And they chose to most often during the transitional seasons, when the boundaries between their world and ours became thin. She used that word specifically, thin, as if the physical landscape contained layers that overlapped in certain places and at certain times. She told me to leave the valley alone. I told her I was not sure I could do that. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has made a decision you know is wrong, but you also know you cannot change. Then she reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and pulled out a small object, a piece of carved bone, roughly 2 inches long, shaped like a figure with long arms and no face. She pressed it into my hand and told me to carry it. She said it would not protect me, but it would let them know that I came with an understanding of what they were. I drove back to Denali with the bone figure in my pocket, feeling its weight against my thigh. And I thought about Thomas Martin walking into that valley alone in 1947 and coming back a different man. I thought about the fact that I was about to do the same thing. Into the valley without a name. We entered the valley on September 26th at first light. There were 3 of us. Rachel carried her recording equipment in a modified pack frame. Matthew carried his rifle, though I noticed he had not chambered a round, as if some part of him understood that the weapon was irrelevant. I carried a GPS unit, a satellite phone, a first aid kit, and the bone carving Nicole had given me. Peterson did not know we were going. I had told him we were conducting a final day of wolf monitoring before breaking camp. I am not proud of the deception, but I was certain that if I told him the truth, he would have pulled my access and shut down the entire operation. The entrance to the valley was unremarkable. A gap between 2 ridges, perhaps 60 yards wide, flanked by slopes of loose scree and low brush. The east fork of the Toklat flowed out of it in a shallow braid that spread across the gravel flats. From the outside, it looked like any of a dozen side drainages in the area. But as soon as we crossed the threshold, the quality of the air changed. Not the temperature, not the humidity, the quality. It became heavier, denser, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. Sound behaved differently in there. Our footsteps on the gravel seemed muted, dampened, as if the valley was absorbing the noise rather than reflecting it. Rachel noticed it first. She stopped and held up her hand, then pointed at her audio display. The ambient noise floor had dropped to near zero. In an open Alaskan valley in September, that should have been impossible. There was always sound, wind across tundra, water over gravel, ravens calling, insects, even in the late season. But her instruments showed a flat line. Silence so complete that it registered as an anomaly in her software. We continued north, following the narrow floor of the valley as it curved gently to the west. The walls rose on either side, steepening as we progressed, until we were walking through a corridor of exposed rock that channeled the light into a narrow beam overhead. The sky was clear, a deep blue, but down in the valley, the illumination had a filtered quality, as if we were moving through water rather than air. At approximately 2 miles in, Matthew stopped. He was ahead of me by about 20 yards, and I watched him freeze in mid-stride, one boot hovering above the ground. He lowered it slowly, silently, and turned back toward me, with an expression I had never seen on a grown man. Not fear exactly, something beyond fear, recognition of something so fundamentally outside his experience that his mind was struggling to process it. He pointed ahead and to the right. On a ledge approximately 40 feet above the valley floor, partially obscured by a jut of gray rock, something was standing. It was upright. It was enormous. Even from that distance, even with the filtered light and the strange visual distortion that the valley seemed to impose, I could see that it was at least 8 feet tall, possibly 9. Its body was covered in hair that was reddish-brown in color, thick and matted across the shoulders and chest, thinner on the limbs. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging past its knees, and its hands, which I could see clearly in profile, were broad and powerful with fingers that curved slightly inward. Its head was conical, tapering upward to a pronounced sagittal crest, and set forward on a neck that was almost non-existent, the skull seeming to sit directly on the massive trapezius muscles. It was watching us, not glancing, not reacting to our presence with the startled attention of a surprised animal. It was watching us with a stillness and intentionality that communicated something unmistakable. It knew we were there. It had known before we entered the valley, and it had chosen to let us see it. Rachel was shaking. I could hear the faint rattle of her equipment against the pack frame. She had her directional microphone pointed at the creature, the gain turned to maximum. I could see from behind her that the waveform display showed a continuous low-frequency oscillation. The creature was producing sound, not a vocalization I could hear with my ears. Infrasound, a constant, deliberate emission that I could feel as a pressure in my sinuses, a tightness in my chest, a faint vibration in my teeth. I do not know how long we stood there. Time behaved strangely in that valley. It could have been 30 seconds. It could have been 5 minutes. The creature did not move. We did not move. The silence held, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat, which seemed absurdly loud in that compressed acoustic space. Then the creature turned its head. Not toward us, away from us, toward the deeper end of the valley, where the corridor narrowed further and the walls converged toward what looked like a dead end. And in that moment, with its head in profile against the pale rock, I saw its face. The features were flattened, prognathous, with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes. The nose was broad and flat, the nostrils wide. The mouth was a thin line, almost lipless, set above a jaw that could have crushed stone. But the eyes were what stopped me. They were brown, deep and intelligent, and, I swear on everything I have ever known, sad. They held an expression that I can only describe as weary recognition, as if this creature had seen humans come into its valley before, many times across many years, and it was tired of the encounter, but not surprised by it. It lowered itself from the ledge in a single fluid motion, dropping the 40 feet to the valley floor, with a controlled descent that should have been impossible for a creature of that mass. It landed in a crouch, the impact sending a tremor through the gravel that I felt in the soles of my boots. Then it stood to its full height, and I realized I had underestimated its size. It was closer to 10 feet. The proportions were not human. They were something adjacent to human, something that had diverged from our lineage at some ancient fork in the evolutionary road and had continued developing in isolation, in places like this valley, for millennia. It looked at me one more time, directly at me, and then it turned and walked deeper into the valley with strides so long and so silent that it seemed to glide rather than walk. In 12 seconds, it was gone, absorbed by the shadows between the converging walls. Matthew sat down on the gravel. He sat down as if his legs had simply stopped supporting him. He put his hands on his knees and stared at the ground and breathed in long, shuddering pulls. Rachel was crying, silently. The tears were running down her cheeks, but she was not sobbing, and she was not wiping them away. She was still holding the microphone, still recording. The professional in her had not stopped working even as the rest of her was overwhelmed. I stood between them and looked at the ledge where the creature had stood, and I realized that I was holding the bone carving in my hand, though I did not remember taking it from my pocket. It was warm, not body temperature warm, warm like it had been sitting in direct sunlight on a summer afternoon, even though the valley air was near freezing. We did not follow the creature. Some instinct, deeper than curiosity, deeper than the drive that had brought us into the valley, told me that what lay beyond that narrowing corridor was not for us. The creature had shown itself. That was the message, and pursuing it further would have been a violation of something I did not fully understand, but felt with absolute certainty. We turned back. The report that was never filed. We reached the East Fork camp by late afternoon. No one spoke during the hike out. The valley released us the way it had received us, gradually, the ambient sounds returning in layers, first the wind, then the water, then a raven's call from somewhere high on the ridge. The world reassembled itself around us, and by the time we were back at the tent, the experience already felt like something that had happened in a separate reality, a parallel timeline that we had somehow crossed into and returned from. Rachel spent the evening processing her recordings. The audio from the valley was extraordinary. The infrasonic emissions from the creature registered as a sustained pattern of low-frequency pulses, each lasting between 3 and 7 seconds, repeating at irregular intervals. She ran the waveforms through her analysis software and showed me something that made my mouth go dry. The pulses were not random. They contained repeating structures, nested patterns within patterns. She was not prepared to call it language, but she said it bore more resemblance to the communication patterns of higher primates than to any environmental or geological phenomenon she had ever recorded. The visual data was less conclusive. In the strange light of the valley, the photographs I had taken were underexposed and grainy, the creature a blurred shape against the rock. Rachel's video, captured on a small camera mounted to her pack, was slightly better but still ambiguous. You could see the outline. You could see the movement, but you could not see the face, the eyes, the expression that had communicated something so profound that I still feel it when I close my own eyes at night. Matthew left the next morning. He packed his gear in silence, shook my hand, and walked south along the riverbank the same way he had arrived. Before he left, he told me something that I have carried with me every day since. He said that the hunter who had disappeared from that tent 7 years ago, the man they never found, was his brother. He said his brother's name was James. He said he did not believe James was dead. He said he believed James had been taken into the place where the tall ones live, and he did not know what that meant. But he knew that whatever it meant, the world was not what he had been told it was. I watched him walk away until the tundra absorbed his silhouette, and then he was gone. Peterson was waiting for me when I returned to the Toklat station. He was sitting in his truck in the parking area, the engine running, the heater on, his breath fogging in the cab. He looked at me through the windshield, and I could see that he already knew. Not the details, not what we had seen, but he knew that we had gone into the valley, and he knew that we had encountered something. He did not yell. He did not threaten disciplinary action. He got out of the truck and walked over to me and put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed, the way a father might, and he said 4 words. "Now you understand why." I did understand. I understood why the reports were marked inconclusive, why the tracks were never catalogued, why the radio frequency was never assigned, why the maps carried a symbol that no one acknowledged. Because the alternative was to admit that the 6 million acres of Denali National Park and Preserve contained something that the Park Service, the government, and the entire framework of institutional knowledge was not equipped to address. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a moose or a wolverine or any of the animals listed in the interpretive displays at the visitor center. Something else, something older, something that had been walking these valleys since before the glaciers retreated, since before the first humans crossed the land bridge from Asia, since before the mountain itself had a name. I filed my end-of-season report in October. It contained wolf survey data, bear activity logs, trail condition assessments, and visitor contact statistics. It did not mention the tracks at the Sanctuary River. It did not mention Rachel Moore or her recordings. It did not mention Matthew Jackson or his missing brother. It did not mention Nicole Martin or her grandfather's journal. It did not mention the valley without a name. But I kept my own records. Field notes, photographs, GPS coordinates, copies of Rachel's audio files on an encrypted drive that I stored in a safety deposit box in Fairbanks. Not because I planned to go public, not because I wanted recognition or vindication, because I needed to know that the evidence existed somewhere, that the encounter was documented, that the creature I had seen on that ledge, with its ancient eyes and its weary intelligence, was not something I had imagined. Rachel continued her research. She sent me periodic emails, carefully worded, never mentioning specifics, always using a coded language we had developed during those days in the field. She told me she had found similar acoustic signatures and recordings from 3 other locations in North America. The pattern was consistent. The infrasonic pulses matched. Whatever was in that valley was not unique to Denali. It was part of something larger, a population, a species, a presence that had been living alongside us in the deep wilderness for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Nicole Martin died 2 winters later. Pneumonia. She was 60. The obituary in the Cantwell Community Newsletter described her as a lifelong resident, a provider of firewood, a quiet neighbor. It did not mention her grandfather's journal. It did not mention the bone carving. It did not mention the tall ones. I still carry the carving. It sits in the left chest pocket of every uniform shirt I own, transferred each morning when I dress for the field. I do not know what it means. I do not know if it offers recognition or protection, or simply serves as a reminder that the boundaries between what we know and what we refuse to know are thinner than we imagine. I still work in Denali. I still patrol the backcountry. I still maintain the trails and monitor the wildlife and respond to the calls that come in from hikers and climbers and visitors who see this landscape as a postcard, a destination, a check mark on a list of places to visit before they die. But I also listen. On quiet nights at the Toklat station, when the seasonal staff are gone and the wind drops to nothing and the tundra stretches out in every direction under a sky thick with stars, I turn the radio dial past the standard channels, past the static and the white noise, and I find that frequency, the one that is not listed, the one that carries a sound that is not quite a sound. And sometimes, from the direction of the valley that has no name, something answers. I do not go into that valley anymore. I am not brave enough, or perhaps I am finally wise enough to understand that some places are not meant for us. The creatures that live there, the tall ones, the watchers, whatever name you give them, they have been in these mountains for longer than memory, longer than language, longer than the stories we tell ourselves about the world and our place in it. They do not need our acknowledgement. They do not need our proof. They do not need us at all. But we need to know they are there, not to hunt them, not to capture them, not to reduce them to a specimen or a photograph or a line in a textbook. We need to know they are there because their existence tells us something essential about the wilderness we claim to protect. It is not ours. It has never been ours. And on the nights when the infrasound rolls down from the high valleys and the caribou stand frozen on the tundra and the wolves go silent, the wilderness reminds us that we are guests here, moving through a landscape that belongs to something far older and far more powerful than anything we have built. I am a park ranger. I have been a park ranger for 18 years, and I am telling you that the map is not the territory. The territory is deeper and stranger and more alive than any map could ever show. And in Denali, at the foot of the tallest mountain on the continent, something walks that we do not have a name for. Something with eyes that have seen the glaciers come and go. Something that watches from the ridgelines and the valleys and the places we have never been and will never go. Something that was here first, and something that will be here long after we are gone. There is a sound that the Mendenhall Glacier makes at 3 in the morning, when no living thing should be listening. It is not the groan of shifting ice or the crack of a calving face splitting free. It is something underneath all of that. Something deeper. Something that travels through the bedrock and into the soles of your boots and up through your spine until your teeth ache with it. I heard that sound for the first time 17 years ago, and I have never been able to unhear it since. I need to get this down while the details are still sharp, while the names and the dates and the coordinates still line up in my memory the way they are supposed to, because I have learned, over the course of these past several weeks, that memories from that glacier have a way of rearranging themselves. They shift and slide the same way the ice does, slow and relentless, until you wake up one morning and the thing you were so certain about has moved 300 yards from where you left it. My post was the Mendenhall Glacier Visitor Center, Tongass National Forest, southeast Alaska. I had been stationed there for 11 years by the time the events I am about to describe took place. 11 years of watching that river of ancient ice retreat a little more each season. 11 years of guiding tourists along the Photo Point Trail and answering the same questions about glacial till and terminal moraines and whether the ice was really that blue or if it was some kind of trick of the light. It is that blue. It is bluer than anything you have ever seen. And that blue goes so deep into the ice that it stops being a color and starts being a place. A cold, still, pressurized place where light itself forgets which direction it came from. The Mendenhall is not a small glacier. It stretches 12 miles from its source in the Juneau icefield to its terminus at Mendenhall Lake. The surrounding wilderness, the Tongass, is the largest national forest in the United States. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest, muskeg bogs, alpine tundra, and old-growth Sitka spruce so dense that a person can vanish 20 feet off a maintained trail and never be found again. I say that not for dramatic effect. I say it because it is a documented fact. People disappear in the Tongass. They disappear with regularity that the administrative offices in Juneau have learned to treat as a seasonal constant, the same way they budget for snowfall totals and salmon run projections. The year everything changed was 2008, October. The visitor center had closed for the season 2 weeks earlier, and the glacier was settling into its winter silence. Most of the seasonal staff had already rotated out. The handful of us who stayed through the cold months were the ones who had made some kind of peace with the isolation, or the ones who had never needed company much in the first place. I fell into both categories. Matthew Jackson arrived on the 14th of October. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of calm, unhurried way of moving that told you he had spent serious time in remote wilderness. He was a wildlife behavioral specialist contracted through the Forest Service, and his assignment was to conduct a 6-week survey of black bear denning patterns along the glacier's eastern lateral moraine. He came with 2 large equipment cases, a worn Kelty backpack that looked like it had been to every mountain range on the continent, and a quiet confidence that I appreciated immediately. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He studied the topographic maps I gave him with focused attention, memorized the coordinates of the emergency cache locations, and checked his satellite phone battery before checking into his quarters. I liked him. I want that to be clear from the beginning. I liked Matthew Jackson, and I trusted his judgment. And when things started going wrong, he was the only person out there whose word I never doubted. The first sign came 3 days after Matthew arrived. I was running a maintenance check on the West Glacier Trail, replacing marker posts that the October storms had knocked loose. The trail follows Mendenhall Lake's western shore before climbing into the forest above the glacier's face. It is a beautiful trail in any season, but in October, with the cottonwoods stripped bare and the light going flat and gray by 3 in the afternoon, it takes on a quality that I can only describe as watchful. The forest does not feel hostile. It feels attentive, as though the trees themselves are aware of you in a way that goes beyond the passive existence of wood and bark and root. I was about 1.5 miles past the trailhead, crouched beside a post, when I noticed the tracks. They were in a patch of soft glacial mud on the uphill side of the trail, partially sheltered by an overhanging spruce bough that had kept the worst of the rain off them. The prints were large, significantly larger than any boot print I had ever seen. Each one measured roughly 17 inches from heel to toe, and the spread across the ball of the foot was at least 7 inches wide. They showed 5 distinct toe impressions, pushed deep into the mud with a weight distribution that was clearly bipedal. The stride length between prints was enormous. I measured it at just over 4 feet. I stood there looking at those tracks for a long time. The forest around me was utterly silent. No wind, no bird call, no distant sound of water running. Just the glacier, far below, doing whatever the glacier does when no one is listening. I have been a ranger long enough to know what bear tracks look like. I have seen every variation of black bear print that the Tongass can produce, from the compact pads of a spring yearling to the splayed, heavy impressions of a mature boar. These were not bear tracks. They were not the tracks of any animal I had been trained to identify. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, noted the GPS coordinates, and continued my maintenance route. I did not radio it in. I did not mention it to anyone when I returned to the station that evening. I am not sure why. Maybe because I already knew, on some level, that drawing attention to those tracks would set something in motion that could not be stopped. Or maybe because some part of me, the rational part that had gotten me through 11 years of wilderness service, refused to give those prints the weight they were asking for. That night, I sat in the station office going through the trail camera archives. We had 8 cameras deployed along the primary trail network, motion-activated units that captured images of wildlife movement for the ongoing ecological monitoring program. I pulled the files from the 2 cameras closest to where I had found the tracks. Camera 6, positioned at the junction of the West Glacier Trail and the spur path to Nugget Falls, had captured 712 images over the previous 72 hours. Deer, porcupine, a young black bear foraging along the lake shore. One blurred image of what appeared to be a river otter crossing the trail at a run. Camera 4, mounted on a spruce trunk roughly 400 yards north of where I had found the tracks, had captured only 19 images in the same period. 17 of them were blank frames, triggered by wind moving the brush. The 18th showed a Sitka black-tailed deer standing motionless in the center of the trail, its head turned to face something off camera to the left. The deer's posture was wrong. Its legs were rigid, its ears were flattened back against its skull. Its eyes, caught in the infrared flash, were wide and fixed, and full of something that I recognized immediately because I had seen it in the eyes of animals before, though rarely. It was not alertness. It was not the coiled readiness of a prey animal that has detected a predator. It was a kind of paralysis, a freezing, as though the deer had encountered something so far outside its experience that its nervous system had simply locked. The 19th image, time-stamped 4 seconds later, showed the same section of trail. The deer was gone. There was nothing else in the frame. But the underbrush on the left side of the trail, the side the deer had been staring toward, was bent and displaced in a pattern consistent with something very large having moved through it. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet office, listening to the building settle around me. Outside, the glacier was making that sound again. The one that is not groaning, the one that is not cracking, the one that comes from underneath. I did not sleep well that night. Matthew Jackson came to find me the following morning while I was checking the weather station instruments behind the visitor center. The sky was low and heavy with the kind of iron-colored cloud cover that southeast Alaska wears for months at a time, and a fine, cold mist was drifting in off the lake. He was carrying his field notebook, and his expression was the carefully neutral look of a professional who has encountered something that does not fit his data set. He asked me if I had been out on the eastern moraine recently. I told him I had not. He nodded slowly, opened his notebook, and showed me a series of sketches. They were precise, rendered with the technical accuracy of someone trained in field documentation. They depicted a cluster of trees, mature Sitka spruce, that had been stripped of their lower branches on one side. The breaks were not clean saw cuts or the ragged tears of storm damage. They appeared to have been twisted, wrenched from the trunks with a rotational force that had left spiraling wounds in the bark. The lowest break was approximately 8 feet from the ground. The highest was at 14 feet. Matthew told me he had found the site the previous afternoon while surveying a drainage channel on the moraine's upper slope. He had initially assumed the damage was from a localized wind shear event, a microburst perhaps, but the pattern was wrong for wind. The breaks were all on the same side of the trees, all facing downslope toward the glacier, and the twisted bark fibers indicated a consistent direction of applied force. Something had stood in that cluster of trees and methodically stripped the branches by hand. Something tall enough to reach 14 feet. Something strong enough to twist green spruce limbs 3 inches thick until they separated from the trunk. I showed him the photographs of the tracks I had found on the West Glacier Trail. He studied them without speaking for a long time. Then he asked me how long I had been at the Mendenhall. I told him 11 years. He asked me if I had ever seen anything like this before. I told him no. And that was the truth. In 11 years I had heard stories. Every ranger in the Tongass has heard stories. The Tlingit people, whose ancestral territory encompasses this entire region, have oral traditions that stretch back thousands of years, and woven through those traditions are accounts of creatures that do not appear in any field guide or species database. The Kushtaka, the wild men of the forest, beings that existed in the spaces between the human world and something older. But stories are stories, and in 11 years of daily patrols through some of the most remote wilderness in North America, I had never encountered physical evidence that those stories had a living, breathing source. Until now. Matthew and I agreed to conduct a joint survey of the area between the West Glacier Trail and the Eastern Moraine. We would document everything we found, establish a grid search pattern, and deploy additional trail cameras at key points. We would keep our work between ourselves until we had enough data to determine what we were dealing with. He was methodical about it, professional, and I was grateful for that. The last thing either of us wanted was to file a report based on a handful of tracks and some broken trees and have it dismissed as overactive imagination or misidentified wildlife sign. We started the next morning at first light, which in October at that latitude means roughly 8:30 in the morning. The mist had thickened overnight into a fog that sat heavy in the glacier valley, reducing visibility to perhaps 200 yards. We began at the trackside on the West Glacier Trail and worked our way north and upslope through the forest toward the moraine. The terrain between the trail and the moraine is dense old growth, a cathedral of spruce and hemlock rising from a floor of deep moss, fallen logs, and the tangled root systems of trees that have been growing in that spot for 400 years or more. The canopy is so thick that even at midday, the forest floor exists in a state of permanent twilight, a green-tinted gloom that makes distance difficult to judge and plays tricks with your peripheral vision. Sound behaves strangely in old-growth forest. It deadens, absorbs. A conversation at normal volume becomes inaudible at 30 yards. A footfall on moss makes no sound at all. We found more tracks within the first hour. 3 separate sets, all showing the same massive bipedal print pattern, all following what appeared to be a consistent route through the forest from the lake shore to the higher elevation terrain near the moraine. The stride length varied between sets, ranging from 3.5 to just over 5 feet, suggesting either different-sized individuals or a single individual moving at different speeds. The prints were at varying stages of weathering, some relatively fresh, others soft-edged and partially filled with rainwater, indicating activity over a period of at least several days. If you are listening to this, and you have stayed with me this far, I want to ask you to take a moment and hit that like button below, and leave a comment telling me if you have ever seen something in the wilderness that you could not explain. And if you have not already, consider subscribing to the channel because the rest of what happened at the Mendenhall Glacier is something I have never told anyone in full until now. At approximately 11:30 that morning, we reached the tree damage site Matthew had described. It was worse than his sketches had suggested. 7 trees in a rough semicircle had been stripped of branches on their glacier-facing sides. The ground beneath them was churned and compressed in a way that suggested something of tremendous weight had spent a significant amount of time there. And there was a smell. Not the clean, sharp scent of broken spruce resin that you would expect from fresh tree damage. Something else underneath it. A dense, musky, organic smell that clung to the fog and seemed to intensify as we moved closer to the center of the disturbed area. Matthew crouched beside one of the damaged trunks and ran his fingers along the twisted bark fibers. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, "This was not territorial marking. This was construction. Whatever did this was building something." I looked at the arrangement of stripped trees again. He was right. The branches had not been ripped away in a frenzy of strength or aggression. They had been removed selectively. The trees that still had intact canopies formed a natural roof over the cleared area. The stripped branches were nowhere to be seen, which meant they had been carried away. Something had cleared a sheltered space in the old-growth forest, 8 feet above the ground, with a canopy overhead and open sight lines toward the glacier. It had built a shelter, a high shelter, one that nothing on the ground could easily reach. We documented everything: photographs, measurements, soil samples from the compressed ground, bark samples from the damaged trees, GPS coordinates for every print, every broken limb, every piece of physical evidence we could identify. By the time we finished, the afternoon light was failing and the fog had closed in so tight that the trees 10 feet ahead of us were gray shapes dissolving into white. That was when we heard it. It came from the direction of the glacier, from somewhere out on the ice or just beyond it. And it was unlike any vocalization I have ever heard from any animal in my career. It was low, profoundly low, a sound that seemed to originate below the threshold of normal hearing, and then rise just enough to become audible, the way a submarine surfacing becomes visible only at the last moment. It was sustained for perhaps 8 seconds, wavering slightly in pitch, and it carried through the fog with a clarity that defied the sound-dampening properties of the old-growth forest around us. Matthew and I looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. The sound faded, and the silence that replaced it was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. We packed our equipment and made our way back to the station without speaking. When we reached the parking area, Matthew stopped and looked back toward the glacier valley. The fog had swallowed everything. The trees, the mountains, the ice. There was nothing but white. He said, "I need to call Nicole." I asked him who Nicole was. He told me she was the best wildlife behavioral analyst he had ever worked with, and that she had spent 20 years studying primate behavior in environments where conventional research protocols did not apply. He told me her name was Nicole Martin. She was 58 years old. She was retired from the Forest Service, and she was the only person he trusted to look at what we had found and give us an honest assessment. I told him to make the call. Nicole Martin arrived at the Mendenhall station 6 days later, on the 23rd of October. She came on the afternoon ferry from Juneau, carrying a single duffel bag and a battered pelican case that she handled with more care than anything else she owned. She was a tall woman, lean, with short gray hair, and the steady, appraising gaze of someone who had spent decades observing things that did not want to be observed. She shook my hand with a firm grip and asked to see the evidence before she unpacked. We spent that first evening in the station office. Matthew had organized everything into a systematic presentation, the kind of structured briefing that I recognized from my own training. Photographs displayed in chronological order, track measurements compiled into a spreadsheet, bark samples sealed in labeled bags, audio recordings from a parabolic microphone that Matthew had deployed at the tree damage site 3 days earlier. The recordings contained mostly ambient forest sound, rain, wind, the distant groaning of the glacier. But at 2:17 in the morning on the 21st of October, the microphone had captured something. A series of percussive impacts, sharp and rhythmic, followed by a low-frequency vocalization similar to what we had heard in the fog, but recorded at closer range. Nicole listened to the recording 3 times without comment. Then she asked Matthew to play it again. After the 4th listen, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for nearly a minute. She told us that the vocalization pattern was consistent with known great ape communication, specifically the long call structures observed in orangutans and, to a lesser extent, in certain gorilla populations. But the frequency was wrong. It was too low. The fundamental frequency of what we had recorded was approximately 19 Hz, which placed it at the very bottom of human audible range and well below anything produced by any known primate species. She said that to produce a sound at that frequency, the vocal apparatus would need to be attached to a body with a chest cavity significantly larger than that of any documented great ape. She asked to see the track site the next morning. We left the station at first light. The weather had shifted overnight. A cold, high-pressure system had moved in from the north, clearing the fog and dropping the temperature to just below freezing. The glacier was visible for the first time in days, a massive blue-white wall at the head of the valley, and the mountains above it were dusted with fresh snow. The forest was brittle and still. Every footstep cracked through the frozen moss with a sound that carried far too well. Nicole moved through the old growth with a practiced ease that told me she had done this many times before, moved through wild places following the traces of things that most people never see. She examined the tracks without speaking, measuring, photographing, crouching low to study the depth and angle of individual toe impressions. At one point, she placed her own hand inside one of the prints for scale. Her spread fingers did not reach the edges. At the tree damage site, she spent over an hour conducting an examination so thorough that it bordered on forensic. She measured the height and angle of every break. She collected additional bark samples. She used a flexible tape to measure the circumference of the damaged trunks at the point of branch separation and calculated the approximate force required to produce the observed damage. Her calculations, which she showed us later, indicated that the branches had been subjected to a rotational torsion force of approximately 800 to 1,200 pounds per square inch at the point of separation. To put that in perspective, the average adult male human can exert a rotational grip force of roughly 80 to 100 pounds per square inch. A mature male grizzly bear, using its jaws, can exert a bite force of approximately 1,200 psi, but these branches had not been bitten. They had been twisted, by hands, or by something that functioned like hands. Nicole stood in the center of the cleared area and looked up at the canopy overhead. Then she looked at me and said, very quietly, "How long has this been here?" I told her I did not know. Matthew had only found it a week earlier, but the weathering on some of the breaks suggested the site had been in use for much longer than that. Weeks, possibly months. She nodded. Then she told us something that changed the way I understood everything that was happening. She said she had seen sites like this before. Not here, not in Alaska, in the Pacific Northwest, in the Cascade Range, and once in the northern Rockies near the Canadian border. She had documented them over a period of 12 years, elevated shelters, constructed resting platforms, organized manipulation of forest materials by something with hands, with intelligence, and with a body plan that did not match any cataloged species. She told us that in every case, the sites had been associated with the same physical evidence we were finding here. Massive bipedal tracks, low-frequency vocalizations, the systematic avoidance of human contact paired with an apparent awareness of human activity patterns that bordered on strategic. She told us that she had published a preliminary paper on her findings 8 years earlier, and that it had effectively ended her career with the Forest Service. The paper had been rejected by every peer-reviewed journal she submitted it to, not on the basis of methodology, which was sound, but on the basis of its conclusions. She had been reassigned to administrative duties, then offered early retirement, which she accepted. Since then, she had continued her research privately, funded by what remained of her savings and the occasional grant from organizations that most of the mainstream research community considered fringe. She told us all of this calmly, without bitterness, without defensiveness, and without any attempt to sensationalize what she was describing. She presented it the way she presented everything, as data, as evidence, as the accumulated result of years of careful, systematic observation by a trained professional who had followed the evidence to a conclusion that the institutional framework she worked within was not prepared to accept. I believed her. Standing there in that silent, frozen forest, with the tracks of something impossible pressed into the mud at our feet and the glacier groaning in the distance, I believed every word she said. Peterson did not. I have not mentioned Peterson until now, because Peterson is difficult to talk about. Not because he was a difficult man. He was not. He was, in many ways, the most competent ranger I have ever worked with. His name was Robert Peterson. He was 64 years old. He had been with the Forest Service for 38 years, the last 15 of them as the senior district ranger for the Mendenhall unit. He was my direct supervisor, and in the decade I had worked under him, I had never seen him make a decision that was not grounded in protocol, precedent, and the accumulated wisdom of a career spent in the Alaskan wilderness. Peterson had been away from the station for the first 2 weeks of October, attending a regional management conference in Anchorage. He returned on the 25th, 2 days after Nicole arrived, and walked into a situation that I imagine must have looked, from his perspective, like a slow-motion breakdown of professional standards. I briefed him in his office that afternoon. I showed him the photographs, the measurements, the track data, the audio recordings. I introduced him to Nicole and let her present her analysis. Matthew was there as well, seated quietly in the corner, watching Peterson the way you watch a jury foreman before a verdict. Peterson listened to everything without interruption. When Nicole finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked 3 questions. First, he asked whether we had considered the possibility that the tracks were a hoax. I told him we had. The depth and consistency of the impressions, the dermal ridge patterns visible in the clearest prints, and the remote, difficult-to-access location of the track sites made fabrication extremely unlikely. You would need prosthetic feet of remarkable sophistication, a method of applying body weight far in excess of any human capacity, and a willingness to spend hours in freezing wilderness terrain in complete isolation, for no audience, with no payoff. Second, he asked whether the tree damage could be attributed to natural causes: wind, lightning, disease. I told him that both Matthew and Nicole had independently ruled out natural causes based on the pattern, direction, and force characteristics of the breaks. Third, he asked Nicole directly whether she was suggesting that a previously undocumented species of large bipedal primate was inhabiting the forest around the Mendenhall Glacier. Nicole looked at him steadily and said yes. That was exactly what she was suggesting. Peterson leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. When he looked up again, his expression was one I recognized. It was the expression of a man who has been given information that he knows is accurate but that contradicts the fundamental operating assumptions of his entire professional life. He told us that he could not, and would not, file an official report based on what we had shown him. He said that the institutional consequences of such a report, for him, for me, for the station, for the Forest Service's credibility in the region, would be catastrophic and irreversible. He said that he had 38 years of service and was not prepared to become the ranger who filed a Bigfoot report. But he did not tell us to stop. That distinction mattered. Peterson was a man who understood the difference between what the institution could absorb and what the evidence demanded. He told us to continue our field work. He told us to be careful. He told us to keep our findings within our group and to let him know immediately if anything changed. And then he said something that I carry with me to this day. He said, I have been in these woods for longer than any of you, and I have heard things at night that I have never put in a report. That does not mean I did not hear them. Over the next 2 weeks, the four of us conducted the most intensive field survey I have ever been part of. We deployed 12 additional trail cameras in a grid pattern covering the area between the West Glacier Trail and the moraine. We established 4 acoustic monitoring stations using parabolic microphones connected to continuous recording units. Matthew mapped every track site, every tree structure, every piece of physical evidence onto a GIS overlay of the Glacier Valley. Nicole compiled behavioral profiles based on the movement patterns emerging from the data. The picture that began to form was more complex and more unsettling than any of us had anticipated. The tracks indicated a minimum of 3 individuals. Nicole identified them based on foot size and stride characteristics. She designated them Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Alpha was the largest, with a foot length of 18 inches and a stride that consistently exceeded 5 feet. Bravo was slightly smaller, with a 16-inch foot, and appeared to travel most frequently along the lake shore and the lower elevation forest. Charlie was the smallest of the 3, with a 14-inch foot, and its tracks were found almost exclusively in association with one of the other 2, never alone. Nicole believed Charlie was a juvenile. The tree structures, we found 2 more in addition to the original site, were located at increasing elevations on the moraine, spaced roughly 3/4 of a mile apart. Each followed the same construction pattern: selective branch removal, cleared interior space, overhead canopy preservation. They were shelters, waypoints, a network of resting sites along a route that led from the lowland forest up toward the glacier itself. The acoustic data was the most disturbing element. The recording units captured vocalizations on 9 of the 14 nights they were operational. The calls followed patterns that Nicole identified as communication sequences, structured exchanges between 2 or more individuals using variations in pitch, duration, and rhythmic spacing to convey what she believed was specific information. Location calls, contact calls, warning calls, the same fundamental categories observed in every social primate species ever studied, but produced at frequencies and volumes that placed the vocalizing animals in a size category that simply did not exist in the scientific literature. On the night of November 2nd, Camera 9, the unit deployed highest on the moraine, captured an image that none of us were prepared for. The image showed the lower portion of the moraine slope in infrared. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. In the center of the frame, partially obscured by a stand of young alder, was a figure. It was standing upright. The visible portion, from approximately mid-thigh to the top of the head, filled the frame vertically, which meant the figure's total height, based on the known distance from the camera to the alder stand and the focal length of the lens, was between 8.5 and 9 feet. It was covered in hair. The infrared rendering showed the hair as a uniform pale gray, but the texture was clearly visible, long, dense, and layered in a pattern consistent with a pelage adapted for extreme cold weather insulation. The body proportions were broadly humanoid but massively built. The shoulders were enormously wide. The arms, what was visible of them, were long and thick, hanging past the point where the frame cut off at the thighs. The head was turned toward the camera, not directly at it, slightly to one side, as though the figure had detected the camera's presence and was studying it from an angle. The face was flat, broad, with heavy brow ridges and deep-set eyes that reflected the infrared flash as 2 pale, luminous points. It was looking at us, through the camera, across time and distance and the comfortable fiction that we are the only intelligent species walking upright on this continent. It was looking at us, and in the flat, dispassionate rendering of the infrared image, there was something in its expression, in the tilt of its head, in the calm, measured way it regarded the camera, that communicated a single, unmistakable message. I know you are here. I have always known you are here. Peterson looked at that image for a very long time. When he finally looked away, his face was gray. November in the Glacier Valley is a different world from October. The light dwindles to a narrow band of gray that clings to the southern horizon for 6 hours before surrendering to the long Alaskan night. The temperature drops steadily toward 0. The forest goes rigid, the muskeg freezes solid, and the glacier, freed from the moderating influence of longer days, begins to make sounds that it does not make in any other season. Deep, structural sounds. The sounds of millions of tons of compressed ice adjusting to the cold with movements so vast and so slow that they register not as events but as conditions. The glacier does not crack in November. It breathes. We had been monitoring the subjects, as Nicole had begun calling them, for 3 weeks when their behavior changed. The track data showed a clear shift in movement patterns beginning around November 5th, where the 3 individuals had previously ranged widely through the lowland forest and along the lake shore. Their activity now concentrated along the moraine's upper reaches, close to the glacier's lateral edge. The tree shelter sites showed increased use. The acoustic monitoring stations recorded vocalizations with greater frequency and greater urgency, the rhythmic patterns compressed and overlapping in a way that Nicole interpreted as heightened communication activity. Something was driving them uphill, toward the ice. Matthew theorized that the shift was seasonal, a response to declining food resources in the lowland areas as the forest locked down for winter. Black bears in the region were entering their dens around the same time, and the general pattern of wildlife movement in late autumn was toward sheltered, defensible positions at moderate elevations. The subjects might be following the same instinct, seeking thermal shelter in the protected microclimate along the glacier's edge, where the ice itself moderated temperature extremes and the moraine's rocky terrain provided natural windbreaks. Nicole was not convinced. She pointed to the vocalization data. The communication patterns did not match a routine seasonal migration. They matched stress responses, alarm calls. The subjects were not moving toward the glacier because it offered better conditions. They were moving toward it because something was pushing them. On the night of November 8th, I learned what that something was. I was alone at the station. Matthew was at his field camp on the moraine. Nicole was at the acoustic monitoring station near the lake shore. Peterson was in Juneau for a supply run and was not expected back until the following afternoon. The temperature outside was 4 degrees below zero. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, and the stars over the glacier were so bright and so numerous that the ice field glowed with a faint, reflected luminescence that made the valley look like it was lit from below. I was in the office reviewing camera data when the satellite phone rang. It was Matthew. His voice was steady but tight, controlled in the way that a person's voice becomes controlled when they are working very hard not to let it shake. He told me to listen. He held the phone away from his ear, and through the static and the compression of the satellite connection, I heard it. Not the low-frequency call we had recorded before. Something different, something I had never heard, not on any recording, not in any account I had ever read or been told. It was a scream, a prolonged, rising, ragged scream that seemed to tear itself from whatever throat produced it with a physical violence that made my skin crawl. It was anguished, it was enraged, and it was close to Matthew's position. The scream cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, I could hear Matthew breathing. Then another sound. Percussive impacts, rapid, rhythmic. The sound of something hitting trees, not branches, trunks. The deep, resonant boom of massive force applied to standing timber, with enough power to make the frozen ground shake. Matthew told me he was at the upper shelter site on the moraine. He told me that approximately 15 minutes earlier, he had heard movement in the forest below his position, heavy footfalls, and the sound of brush being displaced by something large moving at speed. He had positioned himself behind a rock outcrop and used his night vision scope to observe the area. He saw 2 of the subjects, Alpha and Charlie, moving upslope toward the glacier at a pace he described as a run. Not a casual movement, not foraging, a run. The kind of desperate, uncontrolled flight that prey animals exhibit when they are being actively pursued. He did not see what was pursuing them, but he heard it. After Alpha and Charlie had passed his position and disappeared into the moraine's upper reaches, the tree impacts began, down the slope, in the lowland forest. Whatever was down there was hitting the trees with a systematic, deliberate fury that covered an area Matthew estimated at several hundred yards across. And the scream came from down there too. I told him to stay where he was. I told him I was coming. I do not remember the drive from the station to the trailhead. I remember the flashlight beam bouncing off the frozen trail. I remember the sound of my own boots on the hard ground, and the way my breath froze in the air in front of me and hung there, motionless, because there was no wind. None. The forest was completely, absolutely still. I found Matthew at the upper shelter site. He was crouched behind the outcrop with his scope pressed to his eye and his rifle across his knees. He was not a man who frightened easily. I had watched him stand calm and measured in situations that would have sent most people running. But his hands were shaking. The tree impacts had stopped by the time I reached him. The scream had not repeated. The forest below us was silent and lightless and still. We stayed at the outcrop until dawn. Neither of us slept. When the first gray light crept over the eastern peaks and the glacier emerged from the night like a wall of cold blue stone, we made our way down the slope to see what had happened. The damage to the lowland forest was extensive. Over an area of roughly 300 yards, dozens of trees showed fresh impact marks, deep gouges and shattered bark at heights ranging from 6 to 12 feet. Several smaller trees, young spruce and hemlock with trunk diameters of 6 to 8 inches, had been snapped off entirely, not pushed over, snapped. Broken at a height of about 8 feet, with a clean, explosive fracture that sent the upper portions crashing into the surrounding canopy. But it was what we found at the center of the damaged area that stopped us both. Bravo was dead, the second of the three subjects. The one whose tracks we had followed along the lake shore. The one Nicole had characterized as a mid-sized adult. It was lying on its side in a shallow depression between two mature spruce trees. It was enormous. Even crumpled and motionless on the frozen ground, it radiated a physical mass that was staggering. Nicole's size estimates had been accurate. The body was approximately 7.5 feet long from head to toe. It was covered in thick, reddish-brown hair that was matted and darkened with what I initially took for mud, but quickly realized was blood. A great deal of blood. The cause of death was apparent. The left side of the rib cage had been caved inward by an impact of such force that the underlying bone structure was visibly deformed even through the dense hair covering. The animals, the beings, the creatures, I still do not know what word to use. Its left arm was broken in at least 2 places. There were deep, parallel lacerations across the chest and shoulder that had cut through the hair and skin and into the muscle beneath. Whatever had killed it had been stronger than it was. Significantly stronger. I stood there looking at the body of a creature that was not supposed to exist. Killed by something that was, by implication, even more impossible. And I felt the ground shift under my feet. Not literally, something deeper than that. Something in the architecture of what I understood about the world I lived in. The world I had patrolled and maintained and believed I knew for 11 years. Cracked and gave way. And what was underneath was something I did not have a name for. Matthew was on the satellite phone, calling Nicole. His voice was very quiet and very controlled, and the words he said were, "You need to come up here now, and bring Peterson. If you have made it this far into what I am telling you, I appreciate your willingness to hear me out. I know how this sounds. I know what every rational part of your mind is telling you right now. But if you are finding something in this account that resonates, something that matches an experience you have had, or a story someone you trust has told you, please subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who might understand. Because what I am about to tell you about what happened next is the part one have never been able to say out loud until now." Nicole and Peterson arrived at the site together just after 10 in the morning. The temperature was still well below zero, and our breath hung in the air like smoke as we stood around the body and tried to process what we were seeing. Nicole's reaction was the most controlled. She approached the body the way she approached everything, methodically, systematically, with a professional discipline that I found almost unbearable in that moment because of how badly I wanted someone to acknowledge the enormity of what was lying on the ground in front of us. She conducted a preliminary examination. She measured the body. She documented the injuries. She collected hair samples and photographed the hands, which were massive, with thick, calloused fingers and short, blunt nails that were cracked and blackened from use. The hands alone were enough to silence any lingering doubt about what we were looking at. They were primate hands, hominid hands, proportioned like human hands but scaled up to a size that made them look like they belonged to a different order of being entirely. Peterson stood apart from the rest of us. He did not approach the body. He stood at the edge of the damaged area with his arms folded across his chest and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the tree line above us, where the moraine climbed toward the glacier. He looked like a man standing on a shore watching a ship go down. He knew what this meant. He knew what it meant for the institution he had served for 38 years. He knew what it meant for the quiet, manageable world of trail maintenance and visitor management and seasonal wildlife reports that had defined his career and his identity for more than half his life. And he knew, as we all did, that the creature lying dead in front of us was not the creature that had killed it, that something else was up there, something larger, something more powerful. Something that had driven 3 of its own kind up the moraine and into the ice and then come down into the forest and killed one of them with its bare hands. Nicole told us that she believed we were looking at a territorial dispute. She said that the behavioral data, the uphill displacement, the stress vocalizations, the escalating aggression, was consistent with a dominant individual driving a subordinate group out of a shared range. It happened in every primate society she had ever studied. But the scale, the violence, the sheer destructive force on display, that was beyond anything in her experience. She asked me what was above us. Above the moraine, above the tree line. I told her what every ranger at the Mendenhall knows. Above the moraine is the glacier. Above the glacier is the Juneau icefield, 2,000 square miles of ice, extending from the coast ranges to the Canadian border. A wilderness above the wilderness. A place where no human being lives, and where the conditions are so extreme that sustained human presence requires expedition-level support and logistics. A place where anything could exist, for any length of time, without ever being detected. She looked at the glacier. She looked at the body on the ground. Then she said, "They are not coming down from the mountains. The mountains are where they live. They only come down to the forest to feed. And when the dominant male follows them down, the forest becomes a killing ground." We spent the next 3 hours documenting the scene. We photographed everything from every angle. We collected samples. We measured the damage to the surrounding trees and mapped the trajectory of the violence based on the impact patterns and blood evidence. Matthew took GPS coordinates for every significant piece of data. Then Peterson made a decision. He told us that the body had to be moved. He said we could not leave it in the open where it could be discovered by a hiker, a hunter, a photographer, anyone who might stumble into the area and trigger a chain of events that none of us could control. He said that the appropriate course of action was to transport the remains to a secure location and contact the Regional Wildlife Management Office through back channels to arrange for a proper examination by specialists who had the clearance and the institutional protection to handle something of this magnitude. Nicole argued against it. She said the site itself was evidence. She said that moving the body would destroy the context, the spatial relationship between the remains and the surrounding damage, that was essential to understanding what had happened. She said that the responsible thing to do was to secure the site, restrict access, and bring in a qualified team with the authority to conduct a full investigation. Peterson listened. Then he overruled her. He was the senior ranger. It was his district. And in 38 years of service, he had never faced a decision like this one, but the instinct that guided him, the instinct to protect the institution, to manage the situation, to control the information, that instinct was the product of those 38 years, and it ran deeper than anything a week of impossible evidence could uproot. We moved the body. It took all 4 of us. The creature weighed, by our best estimate, between 600 and 700 pounds. We used a cargo sled from the station and dragged it down the moraine and through the forest to a storage facility near the visitor center that was used for equipment and seasonal supplies during the off months. We placed the remains inside, secured the building, and Peterson placed calls to contacts in Anchorage and Washington that I was not privy to. That was November 9th. On November 11th, a team of 4 individuals arrived at the Mendenhall station in an unmarked vehicle. They wore no identifying insignia. They presented credentials to Peterson that he examined and accepted without comment. They spent 6 hours inside the storage facility with the remains. Then they loaded a large, sealed container into their vehicle and drove away. Peterson signed paperwork. The team left. The container left. and the body of the creature that had been lying in the forest 48 hours earlier was gone, as though it had never existed. Nicole was furious. She confronted Peterson in his office that evening, and through the closed door, I could hear her voice, controlled but sharp-edged, telling him that he had just participated in the destruction of the most significant biological discovery in the history of North American wildlife research. Peterson's response, when it came, was quiet. He said, "I know." Matthew left the station 2 days later. His contract was not renewed. He returned to the lower 48 and, as far as I know, never worked for the Forest Service again. I tried to reach him by phone several months after he left. The number had been disconnected. Nicole stayed one more day. Before she left, she gave me a sealed envelope. She told me to open it only if something happened to her. Inside was a USB drive containing copies of every photograph, every measurement, every recording, and every piece of data we had collected. She also included a handwritten letter, addressed to no one in particular, that laid out the full sequence of events in clinical, dispassionate detail. I have that envelope in a safe deposit box in Juneau. I have never opened it. Nicole Martin is still alive, as far as I know, though I have not heard from her in several years. Peterson retired from the Forest Service in 2009, less than a year after the events I have described. He moved to a small house in Sitka and, according to the few mutual acquaintances we still share, rarely speaks about his career. I do not blame him. I understand the weight of what he carried, the weight of knowing something that the world is not ready to know, and choosing, in the end, to carry it in silence rather than let it collapse the structures that he had spent his life building and maintaining. I am still at the Mendenhall. I am still a ranger. I still walk the trails and check the cameras and answer questions about glacial till and terminal moraines and whether the ice is really that blue. It is. And sometimes, in November, when the visitor center is closed and the valley is empty and the glacier is making that sound, the one that is not groaning, the one that is not cracking, the one that comes from underneath, I stand at the edge of the lake and look up at the moraine and the ice field beyond it, and I think about what is up there. What has always been up there? What will still be up there long after the last ranger has locked the last gate and driven away for the last time? The tracks still appear. Every autumn, every spring, I document them. I photograph them. I file them in a personal archive that no one else has access to. I have never filed an official report. 2 years ago, in October of 2006. No, I need to correct that. The timeline shifts on me sometimes. 2 years after the incident, in October of 2010, I was conducting a routine patrol on the moraine when I found a new shelter site, freshly constructed, branches stripped, canopy cleared, the same architecture, the same evidence of intelligence and purpose and adaptation. And inside the cleared area, pressed into a patch of soft ground, were 2 sets of tracks, one very large, one very small. Alpha and Charlie. They had survived. They had come back. I stood in that shelter, in the gray Alaskan light, with the glacier groaning below me and the forest holding its breath above me, and I felt something that I did not expect to feel. Relief. Not for myself, for them. For the fact that somewhere in that vast, ancient, indifferent wilderness, in the spaces between the ice and the stone and the roots of trees that were old before any human set foot on this continent, they were still there, still moving, still building, still watching us from distances we could not close, with patience we could not match, from a world that existed alongside ours but that we had never learned to see. I am not asking you to believe me. Belief is not what this requires. What this requires is the willingness to sit with the possibility that the map is not the territory, that the catalog is not complete, that the forest at the edge of the glacier, the oldest and the largest in the country, still holds things that we have not named and may never name, and that our failure to name them does not make them less real. The glacier is retreating. Every year, it pulls back a little more, exposing ground that has been under ice for thousands of years. And every year, new things emerge from that ground, things that were hidden, things that were waiting. I do not know what will come out of the ice next, but I know that I will be there when it does, and I will write it down. And maybe, if enough of us are willing to listen, the story will finally be told the way it deserves to be told. Not as myth, not as legend, not as campfire entertainment for people who have never spent a night alone in the Tongass. As truth. And that is where this account ends, for now. If this story found its way to you, and you are still here at the end of it, I want you to know that your attention matters. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more. Because there are other glaciers, other forests, other stations where rangers sit alone at night and listen to sounds they cannot explain. And I know their stories too. There is a cassette tape sitting in the top drawer of my desk at home. I have not played it in 3 years. I do not intend to play it ever again. But I know what is on it, every second of it, because the sounds recorded on that tape visit me each night when I close my eyes. 47 minutes of audio from a handheld radio unit, logged on the evening of October 9th, somewhere along the eastern ridge of Mendenhall Glacier in southeast Alaska. 47 minutes that changed everything I thought I understood about the wilderness I swore to protect. I need to tell this story from the beginning. Not because anyone asked me to, but because silence has become heavier than the truth. The transfer paperwork arrived in late August. I had spent the previous 6 years stationed in the interior, running a modest outpost near Denali, where the greatest dangers were hypothermia and the occasional grizzly that wandered too close to the campground. That post was predictable. Lonely, yes, but predictable. The Mendenhall assignment was different. The Tongass National Forest Field Office needed a senior ranger to oversee backcountry operations near the glacier, and my supervisor submitted my name without consulting me first. He said the Glacier District had been cycling through personnel at an unusual rate, 4 rangers in 2 years. None of them filed formal complaints. They simply requested transfers out, and each request was granted within weeks. He told me this with a straight face, as though it were normal. I arrived on September 1st. The air hit me before anything else did. That particular cold that lives near glacial ice, a cold that does not just touch your skin but seems to press into your lungs and settle behind your ribs. The Mendenhall Glacier Visitor Center sat at the end of a paved road, clean and modern and filled with tourists during the day. But the backcountry beyond it, the ridges and valleys and old-growth forest that stretched north toward the ice field, that was my jurisdiction. And out there, the modern world evaporated like breath in freezing air. The station was a 2-room cabin perched on a slope above Mendenhall Lake. The glacier itself dominated the view from the front window, a massive wall of blue and white ice that groaned and cracked at unpredictable intervals. The sounds carried across the water, deep and resonant, like something enormous shifting in its sleep. I told myself it was beautiful. I told myself I was fortunate. But on that first night, sitting alone in the cabin with the wood stove ticking and the glacier moaning across the lake, I felt something I had never experienced in all my years in the field. I felt watched. The first week passed without incident. I familiarized myself with the trail systems, checked the emergency supply caches along the routes, and reviewed the logbooks left by previous rangers. The entries were unremarkable for the most part: weather observations, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, moose, black bears, eagles. But I noticed something strange in the final entries from each of the 4 rangers who had preceded me. The handwriting changed, not dramatically, but enough that someone paying attention would catch it. The letters grew smaller, more compressed, as though the writer was trying to make themselves less visible on the page. And the last entry from each ranger was almost identical in tone. Short, clipped, a single line that read something like, "Requesting transfer, immediate if possible." No explanation, no context, just that quiet, desperate sentence. On September 8th, I met Douglas James. He was 54 years old, a retired fishing boat captain who had reinvented himself as a backcountry trail guide operating out of Juneau. He had been leading groups through the Mendenhall area for over a decade and knew the terrain better than anyone I had encountered. He was broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, the kind of man who measured every step and every word before committing to either. He came by the station that morning to register a group hike he was planning for the following week, a 3-day loop through the West Glacier Trail and up toward the ridgeline above the visitor center. We sat on the porch and drank coffee, and he told me about the glacier. how it had retreated nearly 2 miles since he first started guiding in the area, how the landscape was literally reshaping itself year by year, exposing ground that had been buried under ice for centuries. He pointed to a stretch of rocky shore along the lake where the ice had recently pulled back. Used to be solid glacier right there, he said. Now it is bare rock and mud. The earth underneath has not seen sunlight in maybe 1,000 years. I asked him about the previous rangers, whether he had known any of them. He looked at me for a long moment, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. I knew all 4, he said. Good people, capable. But this place has a way of getting into your head if you let it. I asked him what he meant. He set his cup down and stared out at the glacier. You will hear things out there, he said, especially at night. Sounds that do not match anything in the guidebook. Do yourself a favor. Write them down as wind. That is what I do. He left after that, and I stood on the porch watching his truck disappear down the gravel road. The glacier groaned behind me. I wrote it down as wind. If you are following along with this story and it is pulling you in, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling me about the strangest sound you have ever heard in the wilderness. Your engagement helps more people find these stories. The second week of September brought rain. Not the gentle mist that tourists expect in southeast Alaska, but a relentless vertical downpour that turned every trail into a shallow river and made the forest canopy roar like a stadium crowd. I spent most of those days inside the station, monitoring weather reports and closing trails that had become impassable. The glacier continued its constant soundtrack of cracks and groans, but the rain added a new layer, a hissing white noise that filled every gap between the louder sounds and made the silence, when it came, feel almost violent. Carol Watson arrived at the station on September 15th. She was 50 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of fitness that comes from decades of disciplined outdoor activity rather than any gym membership. She carried a weathered backpack that looked like it had been to more countries than most people visit in a lifetime, and she introduced herself with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She was a freelance wildlife photographer, she explained, specializing in glacial environments. She had permits to camp in the backcountry for 10 days, and she wanted to access the upper ridgeline above the glacier where the mountain goats gathered in early autumn. I reviewed her permits and her gear list. Everything was in order. She had satellite communication equipment, bear spray, and enough experience to make me feel almost unnecessary. Almost. But something made me hesitate before signing off on her itinerary. Have you been out here before? I asked. Twice, she said. 2 years ago, and then again last fall. Beautiful country. The light near the glacier is unlike anywhere else on Earth. Notice anything unusual on those trips? She looked at me with a slight tilt of her head. Define unusual. Sounds. Tracks. Anything that seemed off. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Last October, I was camped about 2 miles north of the lake. I woke up around 3 in the morning because something was moving through the brush near my tent. Something large. I assumed it was a bear, so I did what you do. I made noise. Banged my cook pot. Waited. But the footsteps did not retreat. They circled. For almost 20 minutes, something walked a slow, deliberate circle around my campsite, and then it stopped. Just stopped. And when I checked in the morning, the only tracks I found were my own. I signed her permits and watched her disappear up the West Glacier Trail. I told myself her story was standard backcountry fare. Animals behave strangely, sound travels in deceptive ways near ice and water. There were rational explanations for everything she described. I was still telling myself that 3 days later when Douglas James came back to the station, and this time he was not alone. Benjamin Brooks was with him. 42 years old, lean and intense, with the energy of someone who runs on caffeine and conviction. He was a wildlife biologist, contracted by the Forest Service to study the impact of glacial retreat on local mammal populations. He had been working in the Mendenhall corridor for 6 months, setting up trail cameras and collecting scat samples along the routes where bears and mountain goats moved between the retreating ice and the expanding forest. Show him, Douglas said. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, His face set in an expression I could not quite read. Benjamin opened his laptop on my desk and pulled up a series of photographs, trail camera images, time-stamped and geotagged. The first several showed the usual suspects: a black bear sow with 2 cubs grazing on berries near a creek bed, a mountain goat picking its way along a rocky ledge, a porcupine shuffling across a muddy clearing. Then he clicked to the next image, and the room got quiet. The photograph showed a section of trail about 4 miles north of the station, captured at 2:17 in the morning on September 12th. The camera had been triggered by motion, and the infrared flash had illuminated a stretch of muddy ground between 2 large spruce trees. In the center of the frame, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a footprint. A single footprint, enormous and unmistakable. It was shaped like a human foot, but it was at least 18 inches long and proportionally wide. The toes were distinct, 5 of them, splayed outward as though the owner had been gripping the ground for stability. The depth of the impression suggested something weighing well over 500 pounds. "There is no bear that makes a print like that," Benjamin said. "I have been studying bears in this region for years. Black bears, brown bears, even the coastal grizzlies. None of them leave a track with that morphology. And the stride length between this print and the next one I found was over 5 feet. I looked at Douglas. He was staring at the floor. "How many of these have you found?" I asked. 7, Benjamin said, "all within a 3-mile radius of the glacier, all within the last 2 weeks. And here is the part that concerns me most." He clicked to another photograph. This one showed a tree, a mature Sitka spruce with a trunk about 2 feet in diameter. Starting at roughly 7 feet above the ground, the bark had been stripped away in long vertical gouges, as though something with enormous hands had gripped the tree and peeled it like a banana. The exposed wood underneath was pale and raw, and dark streaks of sap ran down the trunk like blood from a wound. "That damage is fresh," Benjamin said, "within 48 hours of when I photographed it, and it is not bear-marking behavior. Bears rub against trees, they claw at them, they do not peel them from the top down." Douglas finally spoke. "I have been guiding in this area for 12 years. I have seen every animal that lives in this forest. I have tracked wolverines and wolves and bears that would make your blood run cold. But I have never seen anything that could do that to a tree, and I have never seen a footprint like the one in that photograph." I asked them what they thought it was. Neither of them answered immediately. Benjamin closed his laptop slowly and looked at me with an expression that hovered somewhere between embarrassment and fear. "I am a trained field researcher," he said. "I believe in evidence and observation, and every piece of evidence I have collected in the last 2 weeks points to something that should not exist in any field guide or database I have ever consulted." Douglas put it more simply. "Something lives out there near that glacier, something big, and whatever it is, it does not want to be found." That night, after they left, I sat in the station and listened to the rain hammering the roof. The glacier groaned in the distance, and from somewhere in the forest to the north, carried on the wet air like a rumor, I heard a sound, low and sustained and resonant, somewhere between a howl and a vocalization. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Then it stopped, and the only sound was the rain and my own breathing and the steady mechanical ticking of the wood stove. I opened the logbook. I picked up my pen. I wrote it down as wind. September 19th was the day everything changed. I remember the date because it was the first clear morning in almost a week, and the glacier looked like it had been carved from sapphire. The ice caught the low autumn sunlight and threw it back in shades of blue so intense they seemed almost artificial, like something rendered by a computer rather than shaped by nature. I stood on the porch of the station and watched the light move across the frozen surface, and for a few minutes the place felt almost peaceful, almost sacred. The radio call came at 9:14 in the morning. Carol Watson, checking in from her campsite on the upper ridgeline. Her voice was calm but clipped, each word selected with deliberate care. "Ranger Station, this is Watson at Camp 7. I need to report a situation." I keyed the radio. "Go ahead, Carol." "I found something up here, about a quarter mile north of my camp, in a clearing near the tree line. I think you need to see it. Can you describe it?" There was a pause. The static on the radio filled the gap like white noise, like the sound the universe makes when it is holding its breath. "It is a shelter," she said. "Something built a shelter, and it is not human construction." I packed my gear and hiked up the ridgeline trail. The route climbed steeply through old-growth forest, dense stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock draped in moss so thick it muffled every footstep. The higher I climbed, the quieter the forest became. By the time I reached the tree line, the only sounds were my own breathing and the distant popping of the glacier below. Carol met me at the edge of a clearing. She looked like she had not slept. Her camera hung from her neck, but she had not taken any photographs. When I asked her why, she said, "I wanted a witness first." The structure sat in the center of the clearing, partially hidden by a stand of alder bushes. It was roughly 8 feet tall and perhaps 6 feet across, constructed from spruce boughs and stripped bark layered over a framework of branches. The branches had not been cut with any tool I could identify. They had been broken, snapped cleanly at angles that suggested enormous force applied with precision. The bark strips were woven together in a pattern that was too deliberate to be random, but too crude to be human craftsmanship. It looked like something built by hands that understood the concept of shelter, but had never seen a human building. Inside, the ground had been cleared of vegetation and packed smooth. There was a shallow depression in the center, roughly the size and shape of a large person lying on their side. The dirt in the depression was warm. I pressed my palm against it and felt residual heat rising through my glove. Whatever had been lying there had left recently, very recently. The smell hit me next, a heavy, musky odor that was unlike anything in my experience. Not bear, not moose, not any animal I had encountered in 15 years of field work. It was organic and powerful, and somehow old, as though it belonged to a creature whose biology operated on a timeline far longer than anything modern. Carol pointed to the ground near the entrance of the shelter. Footprints. The same enormous, 5-toed prints that Benjamin had photographed on his trail cameras. But these were fresh, and there were dozens of them, moving in and out of the structure in a pattern that suggested repeated use over many days. "It has been living here," Carol said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Whatever made this has been sleeping here, night after night, right above the glacier." I radioed the station and requested that Benjamin Brooks meet us at the ridgeline. He arrived 2 hours later, out of breath and carrying a field kit packed with collection supplies. He spent an hour documenting the site. Measurements, photographs, soil samples, hair fibers caught on the rough bark of the shelter walls. The hair was coarse and reddish-brown, roughly 4 inches long, and it did not match any species in his reference database when he compared it later. "I need to send these samples to the lab in Anchorage," he said. "But I can tell you right now, this does not belong to any cataloged animal in southeast Alaska. The follicle structure is wrong. The diameter is wrong. Everything about it is wrong." While Benjamin worked, I walked a perimeter around the clearing. 50 yards to the north, I found something that stopped me cold. A cache. Piled against the base of a large hemlock tree, partially covered with moss and branches, was a collection of objects. 3 salmon carcasses, stripped of flesh with a thoroughness that went beyond any scavenger behavior I had seen. A section of deer antler, gnawed and polished smooth. And a hiking boot, a single boot, men's size 11, caked in mud and missing its laces. It was a brand I recognized, standard issue for many backcountry outfitters in the Juneau area. I picked up the boot and turned it over. On the inside of the tongue, written in faded marker, were initials. DJ. Douglas James. Before you continue, if this story is keeping you on edge, drop a like on this video and share it with someone who loves a good wilderness mystery. It makes a real difference, and I appreciate every single one of you. I radioed Douglas immediately. He answered on the second call. "Douglas, it is the ranger at Mendenhall. I need you to check something for me. Are you missing a hiking boot? Left foot, size 11, brown leather?" The silence on the other end lasted too long. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "Upper ridgeline, north of the glacier, near a structure." "What kind of structure?" "Douglas, are you missing the boot?" Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register I had not heard from him before. Low and careful, as though someone might be listening. I lost that boot 6 weeks ago. I was guiding a group on the West Glacier Trail, and we stopped to rest near the creek crossing at mile marker 4. I set my boots beside my pack to air out my feet. When I went to put them back on, the left one was gone. Just gone. No tracks, no sound. Nobody in the group saw anything. It was there, and then it was not. And you did not report it? Report what? A missing boot? I told myself a raven took it. They do that sometimes. Take shiny things, things with buckles. I bought a new pair and moved on. But his voice told me he had not moved on. His voice told me he had been carrying the weight of that missing boot for 6 weeks, turning it over in his mind, trying to make it fit into a world where ravens steal footwear and everything has a simple explanation. And now that explanation had collapsed, and he knew it, and I knew it. And the three of us standing on that ridgeline above the glacier knew that we were dealing with something that operated outside the boundaries of what we were trained to understand. Carol Watson left the backcountry that evening. She packed her gear in silence, hiked down to the trailhead, and drove back to Juneau. She told me she would return for the rest of her permitted camping days, but her eyes said otherwise. I did not blame her. The shelter on the ridgeline had taken something from all of us. Not our courage exactly, more like our certainty. That comfortable, unspoken agreement we all carry that says the wilderness, however vast and indifferent, is ultimately knowable. That every sound has a source and every track has an owner, and every mystery, given enough time and evidence, can be solved. That agreement was broken now, and I did not know how to put it back together. Judith Kelly came to me on September 23rd. She was 68 years old, small and deliberate, with hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime working, and eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime watching. She was Tlingit, born and raised in Juneau, and she had spent decades working as a cultural liaison between the indigenous communities and the Forest Service. When she walked into the station that morning, she did not knock. She simply opened the door and stood in the entrance as though she had been expected, as though her arrival was not a visit but a correction to a conversation that had already gone wrong. "You found the shelter," she said. I did not ask how she knew. In a community the size of Juneau, information travels through channels that do not require cell towers or internet connections. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. She sat down, placed her hands flat on her knees, and looked at me with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile. It was patient, the patience of someone who has watched the same mistake repeated by different people across many years. "The Tlingit have a name for what lives near the ice," she said. "We have always known it was there, long before the Forest Service, long before the tourists and the visitor center and the paved roads. The people who lived in this valley understood that certain places are not empty, even when they appear to be. Especially when they appear to be." I asked her what the name was. She shook her head slowly. "The name is not important. What is important is that you understand what you are dealing with. This is not a bear. This is not a lost hiker. This is not a story to be solved or a specimen to be collected. It is a presence. It has been in this valley longer than any living person, and it will be here long after the glacier is gone." She told me stories. Not the kind of stories you find in field guides or research papers, but the kind that are passed down through generations, carried in the same careful way you carry a lit candle through wind. Stories of hunters who ventured too far onto the ice and heard footsteps following them back. Stories of children warned never to play near the glacier after sundown, not because of the crevasses or the cold, but because of what moved in the space between the ice and the tree line when the light went away. Stories of enormous figures seen standing at the edge of the forest, motionless and watching, silhouetted against the blue glow of glacial ice. "Every generation thinks they are the first to discover it," Judith said. "Every generation thinks their cameras and their equipment and their training will be enough to explain it, and every generation learns the same lesson, which is that some things exist beyond the reach of explanation, and the proper response is not curiosity. It is respect." I thought about the shelter on the ridgeline, the warm depression in the dirt, the woven bark, the cache of objects, including Douglas James and his stolen boot. I thought about Carol Watson, circled in the night by something patient and invisible. I thought about the stripped tree bark and the impossible footprints and the sound I had heard on that rainy night. The sound I wrote down as wind because writing it down as anything else would have meant accepting a reality I was not prepared for. "What do you suggest I do?" I asked. Judith looked at me for a long time. "Close the trails," she said. "Tell the tourists the glacier is unstable. Tell your supervisors whatever you need to tell them. But get people away from that ridgeline before the weather turns. Because when winter comes, and the glacier pushes back, and the food sources move lower into the valley, whatever is living up there will come down, and it will not stay on the ridgeline." She left as quietly as she had arrived. I sat at my desk and stared at the glacier through the window, and felt the weight of her words settling over me like snow. I did not close the trails. I want to be honest about that. I did not close them because I did not have a justification that my supervisors would accept. A local elder told me something lives near the glacier is not a reason that appears in any Forest Service protocol manual. I needed evidence that fit within the system, and the evidence I had, footprints and hair samples and a woven shelter, was still sitting in Benjamin Brooks' field kit, waiting for lab results that would not arrive for weeks. So I compromised. I extended the closure radius around the upper ridgeline, citing unstable terrain conditions from the recent rain. I posted advisories at every trailhead warning hikers to stay on marked paths and to avoid the backcountry after sundown. And I began making my own patrols, every evening, walking the perimeter of the expanded closure area with a flashlight and a radio and a growing sense that I was not alone in the forest. It was on one of these patrols, on the evening of September 25th, that I saw Charles Sanders for the first time. He was sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the West Glacier Trail, about 2 miles from the station, staring into the trees with his hands gripping his knees. He was 57, with a weathered face and a thick gray beard and the build of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. He was wearing a Forest Service volunteer vest, the kind issued to the seasonal trail maintenance crews that operated in the Tongass. "Sir, are you all right?" I asked. He looked up at me, and I recognized the expression on his face immediately. It was the same expression I had seen on Carol Watson, the same expression I had caught in my own reflection that morning when I looked in the mirror. It was the expression of someone who has seen something that does not belong in the world they thought they lived in. "I was clearing brush on the East Fork Trail," he said. His voice was steady but thin, as though he was using all his remaining energy to keep it from shaking. "About an hour ago, I had my back to the tree line, working with the loppers, and I heard something behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like pressure, like the air behind me suddenly had weight." He paused and swallowed hard. I turned around, and there was something standing in the trees, maybe 30 yards away. It was tall, taller than any person I have ever seen. 7 feet at least, probably more. It was covered in hair, reddish-brown, matted in some places, long and shaggy in others. It was standing upright on 2 legs, perfectly still, and it was looking at me. "How long did you see it?" "Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. Time stopped making sense. I could not move. I could not breathe. It was like my body knew something my brain had not caught up to yet, something ancient, something that said, do not move, do not run, do not make a sound. And then it turned, not quickly, not like an animal startled by a noise. It turned slowly, deliberately, the way a person turns when they have decided the conversation is over. And it walked into the trees, 3 steps and it was gone. 3 steps. Do you understand what I am telling you? Something that size covered that distance in 3 steps and vanished, into the forest, without a sound. Charles Sanders was not a man prone to exaggeration. I learned that over the following days. He had been a volunteer trail worker for 9 years, a retired heavy equipment operator before that, and a man whose entire adult life had been built on the reliable foundation of physical reality. Things were real or they were not. You could touch them, measure them, move them with machines. The world operated according to rules, and Charles Sanders had never had reason to question those rules until that evening on the East Fork Trail. He questioned them now, and so did I. Brittany Price was not supposed to be in the backcountry. She was 32, a graduate student in environmental policy from the University of Alaska Southeast, and her research permit covered only the visitor center area and the established trail corridors within a mile of the parking lot. But Brittany had the kind of focused determination that treats permit boundaries as suggestions rather than laws. And when she heard about the unusual biological evidence being collected in the upper glacier zone, she decided she needed to see the site herself. She showed up at the station on September 27th, unannounced, carrying a backpack stuffed with sampling equipment and a confidence that bordered on reckless. I told her the upper ridgeline was closed. She told me she understood, but that her research required ground truthing the reports she had heard from Benjamin Brooks. I told her those reports were preliminary and unconfirmed. She told me that was exactly why she needed to verify them personally. We argued for 20 minutes. She was intelligent, articulate, and completely unwilling to accept that there might be a legitimate reason to keep people away from a section of public land. In her framework, restricted access was always about bureaucracy, never about safety. I envied her certainty. I also feared it. In the end, I made a decision that I have replayed in my mind every single day since. I told her I would escort her to the lower section of the ridgeline, but no further. We would stay on the established trail, we would turn back before sundown, and she would follow my instructions without argument. She agreed to these terms with the easy confidence of someone who fully intended to negotiate them later. We set out at noon. The weather was holding, pale gray skies with a ceiling of clouds that sat just above the tree line like a lid on a pot. The glacier was quiet that day, which should have been reassuring but was not. When the glacier is noisy, you know it is shifting, settling, doing the things that glaciers do. When it goes silent, it feels like it is listening. We reached the lower ridgeline by 2:30. The trail narrowed as it climbed above the lake, threading between house-sized boulders deposited by ancient ice movement and dense stands of spruce that blocked the view in every direction. The air temperature dropped as we gained elevation, and by the time we reached the boundary of the closed area, our breath was visible and the ground was hard with frost. "This is as far as we go," I said. Brittany looked past me, up the trail toward the upper ridgeline where the shelter had been found. "The site is less than a mile from here. We could be there in 20 minutes. The area is closed for terrain instability, but the ground looks perfectly stable to me. Brittany, we are turning around." She looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. Not anger, something more complicated. A recognition, perhaps, that my resistance was not about paperwork or protocol, that I was afraid, and that my fear was specific and informed, and based on something she did not yet understand. "What is really up there?" she asked. Before I could answer, we heard it, both of us, at the same time. A sound from the gorge below the trail, a narrow rocky channel where meltwater from the glacier ran in a shallow braided stream. The sound was a vocalization, deep and resonant and sustained, rising from somewhere in the channel with a force that vibrated in my chest. It was not a howl, it was not a scream. It was something between a bellow and a moan, a sound that carried emotional weight, as though whatever produced it was expressing something specific. Warning, territory, grief. I did not know, but I felt it in my bones, and beside me, Brittany Price went absolutely still. The sound lasted perhaps 12 seconds, then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, we heard something else. Rocks, shifting and clattering in the gorge below us, as though something very large and very heavy was moving through the channel, displacing stones with each step. I grabbed Brittany by the arm. "We are leaving, now." She did not argue. Whatever theoretical framework she had brought with her to that ridgeline, whatever confidence she had carried in her backpack alongside her sampling equipment, it collapsed in the space of those 12 seconds. We moved back down the trail at a pace that was not quite running but was far beyond a normal hike. Neither of us spoke. The only sounds were our boots on the frozen ground, our ragged breathing, and the distant rhythmic displacement of rocks in the gorge behind us, keeping pace. We were being followed. The sounds in the gorge matched our speed exactly. When we moved faster, they moved faster. When we paused to catch our breath, they paused. It was deliberate, calculated. Whatever was down there wanted us to know it was there. It wanted us to understand that the distance between us and it was a choice. Its choice, and that choice could change at any moment. If you are still with me at this point in the story, I genuinely want to thank you. Go ahead and hit that like button if your heart is racing right now. And if you have your own theory about what was following us, leave it in the comments. I read every single one. We reached the trailhead at 4:15. The parking lot was empty except for my truck and Brittany's car. The glacier was visible from the lot, enormous and silent, catching the last of the afternoon light. It looked beautiful. It looked innocent. It looked like a postcard. Brittany sat in her car for a long time without starting the engine. I stood beside the driver's side window and waited. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wet but her voice was controlled. "That was not a bear," she said. "No, it was tracking us, deliberately, intelligently." "Yes. What is it?" I did not answer. Not because I did not have a theory, but because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way that I was not sure either of us could handle. The word sat in my mouth like a stone, heavy and ancient and impossible. A word that belongs to campfire stories and tabloid headlines, not to incident reports filed by career rangers with 15 years of service. But the word was there, and it was the only word that fit, and we both knew it even though neither of us said it. Brittany drove back to Juneau that evening. She emailed me the next morning to say she was withdrawing from her field research and transferring to a desk position at the university. She did not explain why. She did not need to. That night, I sat in the station and listened to the glacier and the wind and the forest, and I began to write. Not in the logbook, in a personal notebook that I kept in my desk drawer. I wrote down everything. The footprints, the shelter, the hair samples, Carol Watson and her circling visitor, Douglas James and his stolen boot, Judith Kelly and her stories, Charles Sanders and his 7-foot figure in the tree line, Brittany Price and the thing in the gorge. I wrote it all down because I needed it to exist somewhere outside my own head, somewhere I could look at it and confirm that it was real and that I was not losing my mind. And when I was done writing, I sat in the quiet cabin and stared at the glacier through the window and waited for whatever was going to happen next. October came, and the valley changed. The rain turned to sleet, then to snow. The alder bushes along the trails dropped their leaves and stood bare and skeletal against the white ground. And the glacier seemed to grow in the fading light, its blue wall expanding in the perception of anyone who stared at it long enough. The tourists disappeared almost overnight, replaced by a silence so complete it had texture. You could feel it against your skin. You could taste it in the air, cold and mineral and ancient, like drinking from a stream that runs through stone. The lab results came back from Anchorage on October 3rd. Benjamin Brooks called me from his office at the research station, and I could hear something in his voice that I had never heard before. Not excitement, not the measured enthusiasm of a field professional validating a hypothesis. It was something closer to vertigo. The sound of a person standing at the edge of a cliff they did not know existed until that moment. "The hair samples are back," he said. "They ran them twice to confirm. And the mitochondrial DNA does not match any primate species in the database. It is close to human, closer than gorilla or chimpanzee, but it is not human. The protein analysis shows a metabolic profile adapted to extreme cold environments, with fatty acid compositions that suggest the organism can regulate its body temperature in ways that we have never documented in any known mammal." He paused, and I heard him breathing on the other end of the line. "There is something else. The keratin structure of the hair shaft indicates an organism with a lifespan significantly longer than any great ape on record. The cellular degradation patterns suggest an individual that could be well over 100 years old, maybe older." I asked him what his conclusions were. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My conclusion is that I need to rethink everything I thought I knew about the biological history of this continent. My conclusion is that there is something living in the Mendenhall corridor that represents either an undocumented primate species or something so far outside our current taxonomy that we do not have a category for it. My conclusion is that Judith Kelly was right, and that this thing has been here for a very, very long time." I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat at my desk and looked at the glacier through the window and felt the world shift beneath me, not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but slowly and permanently, like a foundation settling into new ground. 3 days later, on October 6th, Douglas James called me. It was early evening, and the sky was the color of hammered iron, low and heavy with approaching snow. His voice was tight and controlled, the voice of a man using discipline to hold back panic. "I am on the West Glacier Trail," he said. "Mile marker 3, near the creek crossing. I was doing a final sweep of the trail before winter closure, and it is here. What do you see?" "It is standing on the other side of the creek, maybe 40 feet away. It is enormous, 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in reddish-brown hair. It is standing on 2 legs, and it is looking at me. It has been looking at me for the last 5 minutes." I told him to stay calm, to maintain his distance, to begin backing away slowly toward the trailhead. I was already putting on my boots, already grabbing my radio and my pack. "Douglas, I am coming to you. Stay on the radio." "There is something you need to understand," he said, and his voice cracked for the first time. "It is not aggressive. It is not threatening. It is just standing there, watching me. And its eyes are not like an animal. They are aware. They are intelligent. It knows exactly what I am, and it is choosing to let me see it." I ran. I have never moved through that forest as fast as I did that evening. The trail was slick with frost and fallen leaves, and the light was failing, the glow retreating behind the mountains to the west, and leaving the valley in a silver-gray twilight that turned every shadow into a suggestion. I reached mile marker 3 in under 20 minutes, my lungs burning and my legs shaking from the effort. Douglas was still there. He was standing exactly where he said he would be, on the trail near the creek crossing, his radio in one hand and his other hand pressed flat against his chest as though holding his heart in place. He was staring across the creek into the trees. "It is gone," he said. "It left about 2 minutes ago. It turned and walked up the slope and disappeared into the tree line, just like Charles described. 3 steps and it was gone." I crossed the creek and examined the far bank. The mud was soft from the recent rain, and the prints were perfect, deep, 5-toed impressions, each one nearly 2 feet long, spaced more than 5 feet apart. They led up the slope and into the forest, and they did not stop or deviate. Whatever had stood there watching Douglas James had left with purpose and direction, moving toward the upper ridgeline, moving toward the glacier, moving home. We hiked back to the trailhead in silence. The forest was profoundly still, no birds, no wind, no glacial groaning, just the sound of our boots on the trail and the distant muffled rush of meltwater somewhere below us, in the gorge. At the trailhead, Douglas stopped and turned to me. His face in the fading light was older than it had been when I first met him. Not physically older, but experientially older, as though the last hour had added years to the inside of him that had not yet reached his skin. "I have been on the water and in the woods my entire life," he said. 54 years. I thought I knew this place. I thought I knew what shared this valley with us." He shook his head. "We do not know anything. We never did." He drove away, and I stood in the empty parking lot and looked up at the ridgeline above the glacier. The clouds had thinned just enough to let a pale wash of moonlight through, and in that light, the glacier was luminous, glowing from within like something alive. And there, on the ridgeline above it, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, I saw a figure, tall and broad and utterly still, standing at the edge of the tree line, looking down at the valley below, looking down at me. I do not know how long we stood there, the figure and I, separated by a mile of vertical forest and glacial ice and everything I thought I understood about the natural world. It could have been a minute. It could have been 10. Time lost its meaning in that exchange, replaced by something older and more fundamental. Recognition. Not the recognition of a threat, not the recognition of prey or predator, but the recognition of 2 living beings occupying the same space and acknowledging each other across an impossible distance. Then the figure moved. It turned, slowly and deliberately, exactly as Douglas and Charles had described, and it walked along the ridgeline toward the glacier, its massive silhouette shrinking against the sky, until it merged with the ice and the stone and the ancient, patient silence of the mountains. I drove back to the station. I sat at my desk. I picked up the radio and pressed record. That is the tape. 47 minutes of audio that begins with my voice, shaking and thin, describing what I had just witnessed, and ends with silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of everything happening at once, too vast and too incomprehensible to capture in sound. The silence of a world that is bigger and older and stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. I filed my transfer request the next morning. It was approved within a week. I left the Mendenhall station on October 15th and never returned. The glacier is still there. It is smaller now, retreating a little more each year, exposing ground that has been buried under ice since before European contact, since before recorded history, since before the concept of history itself. And as the ice pulls back, the valley below grows wider and wilder and more exposed to whatever has been living at its edges for longer than anyone can remember. I do not know what it is. I am not going to attach a word to it, though the word is there, sitting in my chest like a second heartbeat, as familiar and undeniable as my own name. Judith Kelly told me some things exist beyond the reach of explanation. Douglas James told me we do not know anything. Carol Watson packed her cameras and left. Charles Sanders stopped volunteering. Benjamin Brooks is still waiting for a category that fits. And Brittany Price, the last time I checked, had changed her field of study entirely. She no longer works in environmental policy. She studies folklore now. The stories people tell about the places they are afraid to go, the shapes they see at the edges of their vision, the sounds they hear in the wilderness and write down as wind. I understand her choice. I understand it because I made the same one, in my own way. I chose to stop looking for explanations and start listening to the stories. Because the stories were there first, before the permits and the protocols and the logbooks and the lab results, before the trails and the stations and the visitor centers, before all of it. The stories were there. And so was it. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Leave a like if this one stayed with you, and tell me in the comments, do you believe there are things in the wilderness that we have not yet discovered? I will see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.